10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, Episode 111. Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 111 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate you guys coming back week after week and getting these jazz lessons. Just a note, if you want to get the PDFs to this episode and every single episode that we've ever put out, you can head over to our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/10-minute jazz lesson. Or you can head over to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, and click on one of the Patreon links. That'll take you over to the site. You can get all 111 PDFs over there and start your journey on becoming a better improviser. The PDFs are really essential to some of these lessons. Some of them are more simple than others, but most of them you're going to want to have that resource in front of you in order to really put what I'm teaching you into action. Now, it only costs $3 a month to support us and become one of our members that get those PDFs each and every week, and we truly appreciate all the folks out there that give us their hard-earned money every single month. So let me do a little shout out to all the people that have joined us this week. Thank you to Tyler, Ralph, Jim, Doug, and Theodore for choosing to support us and keep the podcast going and running on all cylinders. So this week's episode comes from a suggestion from one of our listeners. This week comes from John, who's one of our faithful listeners. He asked, I was wondering if you could add some more content about playing bass. Guitar is my main instrument, but I also play some electric bass at a beginner level. The kind of content I'm thinking of might include ways to create a functional bass line for a jazz standard. Should I focus on using the chord tones to be able to create a walking bass? What about other rhythms besides 4 to a bar? So thank you, John, so much for writing in. I'm really excited to do an episode on this. Now, let me put a little disclaimer in here. I am definitely not a bass player, nor do I know how to create really, really good bass lines. What I know how to do is create a functional, simple bass line that I can kind of meander through on piano or on the saxophone if I'm forced into that kind of situation. So, all you bass players out there, you know way, way, way more about this than I do. So I apologize in advance for any of the rules that I'm breaking or anything like that. But I found that this lesson that I'm going to present to you today has helped me in terms of teaching or accompanying somebody, one of my students, on piano in a very, very simple way. Now, I want to also turn this into an episode where I'm really addressing anybody who plays any instrument, not just bass players. So what we're going to talk about is how you can create a clear bass line that will get you through just about any jazz standard that you want to play using a really simple formula. I'm a big fan of formulas. I'm a big fan of sort of codifying something where I can use it anywhere I want to. And again, this isn't like super exciting stuff. I'm not going to get called for any bass gigs or anything like that by showing you this system, but I think it's something that will be useful to you. At least I hope. Okay, so my system of building bass lines consists of two very, very simple things. Actually, let's say 3 very simple things. So I'm always going to play the root on the downbeat, which I think is probably the most important thing out of anything that I'm going to teach you today. And then I'm going to use the 5th. And the reason that I'm using the 5th is because it's very clear and it also avoids falling into the trap of trying to play the tonality that we're in. So when we're using fifths in the absence of a flatted fifth on a half diminished chord or a diminished chord, we can avoid the tonality, right? So if I'm going root to 5, then it doesn't matter if the chord is major or minor. I'm simply just playing root to 5, which are exactly the same. Now, like I said, it gets a little bit more complicated if you have a chord with a flatted fifth, but it is pretty easy to just think about, okay, I've got to flat the fifth on this chord, and then I'm good. So my system comprises of always playing the downbeat, playing the root, then I jump to the fifth, and then usually what I do is, and for purposes of this episode, I go back to the root. And then the final part of this formula that I'm going to show you is I use a chromatic approach tone to the next root that I'm going to. All right, so it's pretty simple. In every measure, I'm going to play exactly the same thing. Now, I'm showing you this in 4/4, and I'm going to show you this with only major and minor chords for now, so you can at least get started. And then maybe I'll do another episode or talk about this further or whatever. But we're going to start off with a very, very simple thing so that you get into the idea and you can practice it a little bit. All right, so I'm in 4/4 and I'm only playing quarter notes. That's another thing, is I'm not really going to address the part of John's question where he asked what other rhythms he can do, because again, I'm not really a bass player, so I don't want to get in over my head here. I'm going to simply concentrate on a walking bass line, 4 quarter notes in each measure of 4/4. So what I play in each measure is I play root, 5, root, and then I do a chromatic approach tone to the next root. And I find this to be extremely, extremely clear and extremely uncomplicated, which is what I'm going for, if that makes sense. All right, so root, 5, root, chromatic approach tone to the next root. So the first exercise on your sheet for the week is simply the circle of fourths. And what I've done is I've just made a major chord for each measure, 12 measure progression that goes around and hits every key following that exact system. Root, 5, root, chromatic approach, right? And then again and again and again. Now, the point of this is that this is very, very clear. I find that that chromatic approach tone to the next root immediately signals in my brain that I'm going to that. And then when I outline the chord by playing root, 5, root, makes it very, very clear what key I'm in at that point. So what I'm going to play for you is simply just the bass line, moving through all 12 keys around the circle of fourths. And what I want you to decide is, can you hear that progression of chords going by? And hopefully you can. So let's check out what the first exercise on your PDF sounds like this week. So hopefully you can hear that cycle of fourths going by. I mean, it doesn't get much more clear than that. So all you would really need is the bass line to signal the passing of all those chords. And that's really the goal of a good bass line, is that you don't really need the chordal input. You could survive with just the bass line. Now, again, like I said, it's not the most interesting bass line in the world. I wouldn't really suggest for any bass player to use just that. But for functional purposes, we should all be able to walk a really, really simple bass line. And I think that this is a great one because I do think that it's clear. And I do think you can actually hear the progression going by, which is really the goal of a simple bass line like this. Now, what I've chosen to do for example number 2 is I've chosen to take the first 8 measures of the standard All the Things You Are and use this exact same formula to actually play over that. So always root, 5, root, chromatic approach to the next one. Now, the cool thing about All the Things You Are is that for the first bunch of measures, it follows the circle of fourths, but then it does break out of that actually in measure 6. So we are challenging ourselves a little bit while staying inside basically that circle of force model for now. So check out what the bass line sounds like over the first 8 bars using this formula of all the things you are, and you should be able to tell that it's all the things you are, hopefully. Check this out. This is your second example for this week. So here's a great challenge for you. Rewind this podcast about 30 seconds, and I want you to try to sing the first 8 bars of the melody to All the Things You Are over that bass line. And I think what you'll find is that it fits pretty nicely, therefore showing you that that bass line is pretty clear. Now, the other really cool thing about this is that you can incorporate this into your repertoire fairly easily. Again, it's just playing roots and fives and then using a chromatic passing tone to the root of the next chord. And then you'll notice at the end of this example, there's 2 bars of the same chord. And all I'm going to do is simply just play root 5, root 5. That's all I really need to do. And then once you start to get good at this, you can start to explore some other possibilities, hitting some of the other chord tones, making your bass lines a little bit more complicated, incorporating a few eighth notes into the bass line. In fact, maybe we'll do another episode on that to take the next step. But I want to give you guys some time to work on this if you've never ever done it before. And you could do this on any instrument. Like I said, I do this on saxophone all the time, and it has the same effect as doing it on piano or doing it on bass. And that's another beautiful thing about this. All right, so hopefully that helps you. Thank you so much for the question. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you, John. We're going to do another listener question episode next week. So this is really great. I love giving advice on your suggestions, because then I can be sure that the podcast is really geared towards some of the stuff that you're wondering about out there. So don't hesitate to reach out, 10minutejazzlesson@gmail.com. I also apologize for going over time this week, but sometimes these explanations just run a little bit long, and I want to make sure I get all the information in there. All right? So if you haven't checked out the Patreon, this would be a great episode to grab the PDF for and make sure that you're studying it so you can learn to play these bass lines. Patreon.com/10minutejazzlesson. Join the over 150 people that are already supporting us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We appreciate it so much. And we'll see you on Monday with a Motivation Monday episode. Have a great weekend, everybody. Talk to you soon. Bye.